Welcome Aminah, welcome Owen, welcome Isaac. Good evening, welcome panelists. I can see people are starting to come in on the Zoom, that's fantastic. Hello to our live audience. This is Canada and Cuba, past and present. I am thrilled to be joined today by Owen Schalk, Isaac Saney, Aminah Sheikh for the event Canada and Cuba, past and present. My name is Bianca Jenny, and I'm with the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, who are the organizers of today's event. I'm coming to you from the Kanien'kehá:ka territory of Tiohtià:ke or Montreal. And so today we'll be hearing from our three panelists, one after another, and then following that, we're going to have a brief Q&A with our audience. So please do put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try and get to as many as we can, time permitting. The chat's going to be open for all of you to say hi, tell us where you're tuning in from. And I think it goes without saying that please do try and keep your comments civil, cordial, and free from harmful commentary. So today's event, Canada and Cuba, past and present. We hear so much about how Ottawa has stood up to Washington on Cuba. So after the Cuban Revolution, for instance, Canada did not break off diplomatic relations, even though almost every other country in the hemisphere did. The reality, however, of cordial relations between Cuba and Canada is more complicated than is often presented, and we're going to hear a bit more about that tonight. In the book, 3 Nights in Havana, Pierre Trudeau, Fidel Castro, and the Cold War explains part of why Ottawa did maintain diplomatic and economic relations. And there's a quote in there that says, recently declassified State Department documents have revealed that far from encouraging Canada to support the embargo, the United States secretly urged Diefenbaker to maintain normal relations because it was thought that Canada would be well positioned to gather intelligence on the island. Simply put, the Canadian embassy in Havana could spy for the US. And over the years, Ottawa has aligned with US fear-mongering about the Cuban menace in the Americas and elsewhere. In the late 1970s, for instance, Trudeau Sr. Condemned Cuban efforts to defend the newly independent Angola from apartheid South Africa's invasion. More recently, Justin Trudeau in his campaign around Venezuela and in their bid to help with the overturn of that government, also applied pressure on Cuba to reduce the cordiality of their relations. So tonight, our speakers are going to unpackage some of Canada's diplomatic history. We'll be talking about how the media portrays this island nation. We're going to be talking about lessons that we can learn, as well as what meaningful solidarity could look like. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker of the evening, Owen Schalk. Owen is a columnist at Canadian Dimension. Owen's written for Alborada, Monthly Review, Protein Magazine, and many other publications. His journalistic work focuses on Canada's domestic and foreign policy. He's the author of Canada in Afghanistan, A History of Military, Diplomatic, Political, and Media Failure, 2003 to 2023. Welcome, Owen.
Hello, everybody. I'll just start by saying thank you to the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute for hosting this discussion on Canada and Cuba, and thank you for inviting me to discuss the ongoing Cuban Revolution and also to clear up some misconceptions about the nature of Canadian policy toward Cuba, which is often very hypocritical and worth examining through a critical frame. I visited Cuba with the Che Guevara Work Brigade in early 2022. I had the privilege of volunteering on Cuban farms and visiting hospitals, learning about Cuban healthcare, agriculture, and social and economic policies, and also attending the May Day celebration in Havana, which was one of the most memorable days of my life. Cuban culture is so magnetic and inspiring, as I'm sure the other guests will speak to, and I can't wait to return in the near future. And in my opinion, the US government's effort to strangle Cuba's revolutionary project into submission is among the worst of its many global crimes. Certainly, it's one of the most continuous, having gone on for about 60 years now. We don't know how many thousands of Cubans have died due to the economic devastation of the blockade, but we can imagine the number, and it's chilling. We do know, however, that the blockade has deprived Cuba of, I believe the number is $130 billion in government revenues since 1962. And we know that hundreds of thousands of Cubans have been forced to flee these externally imposed conditions. We also know that the blockade is rejected globally, as regular votes at the UN General Assembly show. Every country condemns the blockade, minus the US and Israel, and a handful of abstentions by some US allies. But even Canada votes to condemn the blockade, and Canada is pathetically subservient to the US. This is one of several actions taken by Canada toward Cuba that have created this idea of Canada being a voice in the hemisphere that is independent of the US on Cuba and on other things. And what I'd like to show in my contribution this evening is that such an understanding of Canadian policy is erroneous, and there are historical and material reasons why Canadian policy toward Cuba developed in this way. And they don't necessarily show Canada to be a moral or independent actor in the region. So I think there are a number of misconceptions about the nature of Canadian policy toward Cuba historically and today. Canada has not joined in the blockade, that is true, and Canada remains engaged with the Cuban economy in a range of sectors. But we have to be careful about how we understand and characterize Canada-Cuba relations, and we need to understand the nuances of this topic. So Canada is ostensibly, at least in terms of its votes at the UN, anti-blockade. But as I've said, so is every country on earth except the US and Israel. Canada remains economically engaged with Cuba to an extent, but Ottawa is not an opponent of the blockade in the way that, say, Venezuela or Mexico are. And diplomatically, Canada has totally adopted the US line on events in Cuba. That line being that deprivation and unrest are purely the result of a corrupt and inefficient government that represses its people, whose spontaneous uprising in the form of the July 11th protest is evidence of their supposed longing for freedom, democracy, and capitalism. This has been the Canadian line on Cuba for a long time now. We just have to look at government statements on Cuba in the past few years, even preceding the July 11th protests. So in late February 2021, shortly after the Biden administration came to power, Global Affairs Canada released a communique following a meeting between then Minister of Foreign Affairs Marc Garneau and Antony Blinken. The communique noted, quote, "Both men reaffirmed a commitment to address human rights and needed reforms in Cuba." So right there, the Trudeau government aligned itself with the US on Cuba, despite Canada's voting record at the UN, and agreed with Washington that Cuba should be pressured to change its system of governance. What Canada did with this statement was help justify the US blockade that it consistently votes against at the UN. Because if Canada agrees with the US that the Cuban government needs to be forced to reform itself, then it is by implication agreeing with whatever methods the US adopts in that vein, including the blockade. And when July 11th happened, the Canadian government and media really turned up the heat. Ottawa completely sided with anti-government forces inside and outside Cuba, with Trudeau officials stating that the Cuban government's reaction was uniquely violent and repressive. In the end, one protester died, several sustained injuries, and several hundred were arrested, which was a much less violent reaction to protests than happened 2 years later in Peru, also in Colombia, Ecuador, and Chile, countries in which Canada has much more investment and much more ability to invest than in Cuba. All of these examples of state repression were supported by the Canadian government. And following the July 11th protests, Trudeau stated that his government was deeply concerned by the violent crackdown on protests by the Cuban regime, while criticizing what he described as repression by the authorities of peaceful demonstrators. Meanwhile, a spokesperson from Global Affairs stated that his department had deep concerns over the violent crackdown on protests in Cuba and the repressive measures against peaceful protesters, journalists, and activists, as well as the harsh sentencing of protesters. The spokesperson also claimed that Ottawa stands with the people of Cuba in their aspiration for democracy. In November of that year, Global Affairs reiterated its position by telling CBC News that Canada strongly advocates for freedom of expression, freedom of movement, and the right to peaceful assembly free from intimidation throughout the world, including in Cuba. And 1 year after the protests, the Canadian embassy in Cuba tweeted, "Canada remains deeply concerned by the harsh treatment of those involved in those events. Canada advocates for the freedom of expression and for the rights of the people of Cuba to peacefully assemble." Of course, statements as vehemently anti-government as these have not appeared during the Peru protests. They didn't materialize during the protests in Colombia or Chile or Ecuador. And in all of those cases, the government crackdowns were far more aggressive and violent than that of Cuban authorities. I mean, take the Peru protest, almost 70 people killed, thousands injured and arrested. Colombia, dozens killed and missing, hundreds injured, hundreds arrested. Chile, dozens killed, over 10,000 injured, thousands detained. The latest Ecuador protest, 5 killed, hundreds injured and detained. And years before that, under another Canadian ally, Lenin Moreno, multiple people killed by police, thousands injured and detained. I mean, the numbers are way higher than during the July 11th protests, but condemnations by Ottawa and the Canadian media and demands for reform are reserved for Cuba. It's absurd, and it shows that the Canadian government does not have and never had sympathy for Cuba specifically, but also for democracy and human rights throughout Latin America. So I want to go back to the idea that Canada supports or has supported Cuba to some extent. It's a history that is much more complicated than the prevailing myths. For instance, when Batista controlled Cuba with an iron fist, massacring protesters and dissidents while enriching himself, his inner circle, and the mafia, the Canadian government was very sympathetic to him. The Canadian ambassador to Cuba referred to Batista as, quote, "still the best hope for the future of Cuba because he offered the stability demanded by foreign investors." And for Canadian business interests, banks, and other companies, Batista did serve their interests. These Canadian companies had long been invested in US-occupied Cuba. For example, the Canadian Journal of Commerce wrote in the early 20th century, "Canadian capital and clearer northern brains are turning Cuba into a modern hive of industry." And a year before the triumph of the revolution, the Canadian ambassador stated, "The benevolence of President Batista is not to be questioned. He may be lining his pockets at Cuba's expense, but it is traditional for Cuban presidents to do so." So the Canadian government ignored Batista's staggering array of crimes and praised him because he served Canadian business interests well. It's the same reason that Ottawa supported the Somoza dynasty in Nicaragua, General Pinochet in Chile, the Guatemalan military dictatorship, and an assortment of basically fascist governments in Latin America. The Canadian ambassador at that time also described Fidel Castro as, quote, "an infection," and called on Canada to halt the cancerous growth of revolution in Latin America. But even though the Canadian ambassador gave such an enthusiastic assessment of Batista, the idea still managed to form that Canada has historically supported the independence and sovereignty of Cubans. This idea really took root under Pierre Trudeau, I think, when he traveled to Cuba in 1976 and praised the achievements of the revolution and proclaimed, "Long live Cuba and the Cuban people, long live Prime Minister Comandante Fidel Castro, long live Cuban-Canadian friendship." This has become something of a seminal moment in Canadian politics. It was and still is a cause of rancor among Canadian conservatives who believe, rather ridiculously, that the visit revealed that Trudeau has some kind of ideological affinity with Castro, rather than the truth of the matter, which was that he, like all Canadian politicians, was an opportunist. In reality, Pierre Trudeau's visit to Cuba was, in the words of journalist and author Peter McFarlane, an impressive piece of political theater. Trudeau did not care about the sovereignty of Latin America. He saw the region as a lucrative space for Canadian businesses to infiltrate and conquer, just like all the other prime ministers that this country has had. Indeed, what is often left out of the discussions of Trudeau's visit to Cuba was that it was part of a broader Latin America tour, which also saw him travel to Mexico and Venezuela. And it was undertaken in the context of widespread domestic and regional criticism for the fact that Canada backed Pinochet's coup against Allende in Chile. As I'm sure many listeners know, Trudeau assisted the US in isolating Allende internationally and economically. And after the Pinochet coup, the Canadian ambassador to Chile sent several messages to Ottawa praising Pinochet, just as the Canadian ambassador to Cuba had praised Batista. The Canadian government also refused to allow Chilean refugees into Canada for a long time because they didn't want to allow Chileans with socialist or communist politics into the country. Ottawa only relented after a long campaign to pressure Canada to let these refugees in. And of course, right from the get-go, Canadian mining companies that had been marginalized under Allende poured into Pinochet's Chile and profited enormously from the military dictatorship. And furthermore, during the Trudeau period, there were cases of Canadian meddling in Cuba. In fact, there were Canadian spies operating in Cuba, including a man named Ronald Lippert, who was also apparently smuggling explosives into Cuba on the CIA's behalf. And then when Cuba began supporting the African liberation movements, Canada began to take a harder line because Canada was very anti-African liberation. Trudeau even described himself as being horrified by Cuba's decision to send supporting soldiers to the freedom fighters in Africa, another indication that there was no ideological sympathy between him and the revolution. So what do these events tell us? The Canadian government has never had sympathy with the Cuban Revolution, but Ottawa and its leaders have opportunistically used their relations with Cuba as a way to craft a flawed picture of Canada as an independent and unbiased actor in the hemisphere who acts totally independently from US imperialism. This is most certainly not the case. Canada's continued relations with Cuba have often been falsely held up as evidence of our government's independence from Washington. But even that facade is cracking now because the Justin Trudeau government has aligned itself so completely with the Trump and Biden views on Cuba. And if he continues in this vein, helping the US attack and isolate Cuba, it will only become more and more difficult to uphold this fiction of Canadian independence from the US. And that brings my contribution to an end. Thank you to Bianca and everyone else for your time and your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Owen. Thank you for that incredibly important background and for just the important elaboration on the truly complicated nature of the relationship between Canada and Cuba, and also for pointing out these various hypocrisies in media coverage and unbalanced support for various Latin American countries, and much, much more. I posted some of Owen's articles, Solidarity with Cuba Cannot Be Blockaded, and Protesting Cuba versus Peru, a case study in Canadian hypocrisy, for people to do some additional reading. And you can also find out more about Owen's work and writing at owenschalk.com. I've also posted that in the chat. Thank you so much, Owen. I look forward to hearing more from you in the Q&A. Our next speaker of the evening is Aminah Sheikh. Aminah is a union organizer in Canada. She completed her master's in Globalisation and Development with a specialisation in gender at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Recently, she was elected to the executive of the Canada Cuba Friendship Association and received a scholarship to attend the annual Che Guevara Brigade. Welcome, Aminah.
Thank you for having me, and I'm so happy that we got to collaborate, Bianca. I always follow your work and I admire you. I've learned so much about Haiti and all the other issues that you guys cover on with the CFPI. So I just wanted to echo a little bit about what Owen was saying about the sort of hypocrisy that Canada Canada pretends to be independent of the US with its relationships with Cuba, but like most recently we saw in the pandemic, the healthcare crisis because of decades of austerity in all the provinces. And we saw that Manitoba chiefs had requested to the federal government, Justin Trudeau, for Cuban doctors to be sent to Manitoba to assist with their communities. And really it was rejected by Chrystia Freeland and was rejected by the federal government, when really it was something that the communities decided for themselves, and they were working in partnership with Cuban doctors, and they were going to send Indigenous healthcare practitioners to also go study in Cuba. And that is just another example of the hypocrisy and how this government really has assisted the United States in its embargo and its war on Cuba. I just wanted to talk a little bit about what brought me into sort of the Cuba Solidarity work. I am a union organizer, and over the years of doing external and internal union votes, I just met trade unionists in the Canadian labor movement from all sorts of places. And really, I learned a lot. I learned a lot about places that I've never been to. I learned from comrades about Guyana, Jamaica, South Korea, and I really learned a lot. And Cuba was one of those places that another trade unionist told me I should go visit. So in 2016, she convinced me to travel there as a tourist. And it was really an experience that I've never had before. I learned a lot in that experience, just vacationing in Veradero and going to Havana as a tourist. I saw that it was like so beautiful, really safe, really hospitable. And I came back thinking, I'm still really interested in Cuba. And I always stayed involved in Latin America solidarity groups and very interested in learning about the Cuban Revolution. And slowly, I made myself into an organization called the Canada Cuba Friendship Association, where I recently was elected to be part of the executive. And that's when I learned about the annual Che Guevara Brigade that Owen also went on. And, I had interest in it, and I thought, I've never been on a brigade, and this was my opportunity to sort of see what it was about, but I had no idea. And the Canada Cuba Friendship Association actually gave me a scholarship, which I applied for, and other trade unionists sort of pushed me to go with the brigade. And in the past, I did hear about so many people going during May Day, and that May Day was a really big deal in Cuba. And I always wanted to witness it. I just never could. And so this was the perfect opportunity. So I went this May 2023, and a little bit about what I experienced and what really transformed my understanding of Cuba and the Cuban Revolution was hearing from the different organizations we visited. So we went to cultural institutions, we went to galleries, but we also visited a art collective where I was able to hear from artists in a trade union and from the Ministry of Culture as well. And it was really important for my understanding because without delving deep into all the myths and anti-Cuba propaganda, because that's not what this is about. And I like to focus on, the truth and what I learned from my work as an organizer and worker to worker solidarity. I learned from Cuban workers that, that the project of socialism enhanced worker participation and really enhanced Cuban democracy, and that we could learn a lot as trade unionists. And if we look at a lot of the reports from large unions in Canada, like CUPE, NUPG, and I've even looked at reports of solidarity brigades from Britain, Ireland. There's a lot of information about how Cuba's worker assemblies, Cuba's trade unions are incredibly detailed and democratic. And from the artists union, I learned myself that artists are able to be in unions, which is very different than what we see in Canada, right? And I learned that not only that are they allowed to participate in the trade union, they also have a lot of the rights that other workers have. So Cuba has one of the most progressive parental leave, maternity leave, and it has been expanded on with this recent family code elections that happened. And also learned that their labor code is through vigorous consultative processes that have happened in 2010 through worker participation. And just hearing the accounts of workers really showed me that at every level, from municipal, provincial to the state level, all the way to the workshop floor, is elections and democracy and participation. And why I want to emphasize that is because, even just not being super informed about Cuba before traveling, but learning about it slowly, just as a trade unionist, people in Canada and the US have a lot of misconceptions. And some of those misconceptions is that that the state is not led by the people. And that's precisely the opposite of what I learned. Another account that I heard from sugar workers was that, which was really profound, was that when it gets really, really hot, they're able to take a rest because it's really, really hot in the workplace. And why this stood out to me, and this worker that told about this account was talking about working in the DR as well, the Dominican Republic. And he was trying to explain the union difference and why workers had it better in Cuba. And why this stood out to me, because I was thinking about all the thousands of Teamsters workers in America who are complaining about heat inside their workplaces, right? And they can't just stop working. And this is just a few examples of what the Cuban people have achieved through their unions and what they achieved through their communities as well. But another big part of like what I learned from workers there was that women also had time to take for domestic care of the children. So and that was included in the workday. So if you had a child, also if you had a child that had disabilities or any sort of needs that needed to be met, you could take like a year of salary, a year of leave to take care of that child. And if anything, the family code has expanded on that to include grandparents and also to include non-traditional families. And so I really learned a lot through the art collective and like from hearing from other labor reports about Cuba. This trip also, what I really stood out to me too was, and it stood out to me in 2016. In 2016, when I was walking in the streets of Cuba, someone showed me the local mosque. And why that stood out to me is because another big misconception is that people say that there is no religious freedom in Cuba, and that, I don't even know what to say about the myth, but going there and witnessing as a Muslim, as someone who grew up in Canada, what stood out to me was that our tour guide said in front of the mosque in Havana, same mosque I saw in 2016, said that they were building another mosque, but also in this very like happy way, he said, oh, and there's 2,000 new converts in Cuba. And that really stood out to me because it was like, I've never in my entire life, being born in Canada, heard anybody be proud about Muslim converts. And Cuba, and I actually looked into it, and so Cuba actually has a growing Muslim community, and they're not they're Cubans. And another comrade who came from the brigade from Ireland and England, he actually had the opportunity to go pray with the local community there. And he said that they didn't really know Arabic, but they really invited him in. And he found that group on Facebook, so if we're saying there's no religious freedom, he found the group on Facebook, and there's a growing Muslim group population happening there. And, I just wanted to say a quote that I saw in a book as I walked through Cuba a few times. There are 10,000 times more coincidences between Christianity and communism than between Christianity and capitalism. This was from Fidel Castro, and I saw this quote and it stayed with me. And he also said that there are no contradictions between the aims of religion and those of socialism. And I really do see that. And, just as my experience of being a Muslim in Cuba, I really did find that people understood me, and I found that people were very respectful, and I feel that it's a sign to say that it's a growing Muslim community happening there. And I was able to learn too that in 2006, I'm originally from Pakistan, the Cuban government gave 1,000 scholarships to Pakistanis to come study in the Cuban healthcare education program. And also Cuba sent doctors to help during the earthquake. And it's just a testament of how Cuba's internationalism and solidarity is like very much felt and seen. And I think that, you know, what Owen talked about too is that so many countries have voted against the embargo, have voted against the cruel sanctions that the United States has put on. And I think that it's because of Cuba's generosity to places like Pakistan. And I really saw a lot from visiting the art collective, but I also saw a lot from just being in Havana. And another part that really stood out to me was the international nights that we had. So if you do consider going on a brigade, and I just wanted to touch upon the difference of traveling alone and doing the tourism side, is when you go with the brigades in Cuba during May Day, we got to come together with about 1,000 delegates, where we had international nights, and you get a lot of opportunity to connect with other political organizations, activists, and comrades from like all over the world. And I think that experience is something that can't be done individually. And I think it's important conversations to have, because we can learn so much from each other. And it's again, as a trade unionist, you can learn so much about how unions and workers and communities organize too, how locally communities are organizing, and that everything there is done so differently than what we see where we live, where everything's done so communally and collectively, down to education, to caring of children, to caring of the elderly. And it really is eye-opening to witness it and be there. And I really would encourage people to consider going on a delegation or going with a group, because it really also gives you an opportunity to make connections and then only help further your understanding, and because you get to have those great conversations and discussions. And I think a face-to-face conversation is, as an organizer, is the way we need to continue learning and continue building solidarity.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Aminah. Thank you for your analysis and for correcting so many of the misconceptions that we have, including around things like freedom of religion, highlighting the many achievements of Cuban society and the Cuban Revolution. And I must say that as you were talking, one of the details that stood out to me was Chrystia Freeland's veto on Cuban medical assistance during the pandemic. I mean, just appalling. But I'm so grateful to be able to hear about your journey, both as a trade unionist and also recently your inspiring visit to Cuba. And thank you for reaching out to me to collaborate on this event. And I look very forward to hearing more from you in the Q&A. Also just want to mention that Isaac posted information about the Che Guevara Volunteer Work Brigade in the chat. You can find out about that at the Canadian Network on cuba.ca/brigade. Our next speaker is Isaac Saney. Oh, hold on one second. It's just my kid. Sorry about that. Isaac teaches at Dalhousie University and holds a PhD in history from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. His teaching has encompassed courses on Africa, the Caribbean, Cuba, Black Canadian history. He's the author of the widely acclaimed book, Cuba, A Revolution in Motion, as well as Cuba, Africa, and Apartheid's End, Africa's Children Return. He's also an adjunct professor in history at St. Mary's University. Thank you, Isaac, for being here. Welcome, welcome.
Yeah. And thank you, Bianca, and greetings to your child. I'm glad I'm not the only one whose daughter or child becomes a participant in these webinars. It's my beautiful daughter, Ash, is a frequent participant, not only in webinars I participate in, but in lectures I gave during the COVID pandemic. The first thing I'd like to acknowledge, I'm speaking to you, I'm normally from Halifax, but in Nova Scotia, but I'm speaking to you from St. John, New Brunswick, which is the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Olas Tuig, the Mi'kmaq, and the Pasquanadi peoples and nations. And it's important to understand that, as you know, many of the in the two previous presentations by Owen and Aminah, a lot of the hypocrisy of Canadian policy came out. And Aminah spoke about the fact that when the Manitoba First Nations had asked for assistance from Cuban doctors, it was turned down by the Canadian government. I think it's important to understand a very interesting point here. When this first request was made, and in fact, an agreement had actually been reached to send a Cuban medical expert who actually was given a visa, okay, to come to Canada. She is the leading expert who comes in, sees the ground, right, and then makes recommendations about what kind of medical professionals that need to be sent, right? And for 2 years, she waited on her visa to be basically, shall we say, she had visa, but for the visa to actually be implemented, right? And the Cubans held her back for 2 years, and the Canadian government did anything. And I think one of the important points too is, as we hold in this webinar, it's not just the hypocrisy of Canadian foreign policy. I mean, one other example, which is just in the news, is Owen, right? The former Attorney General, Liberal General, a very important person in the Liberal Party. It's just been announced in so many newspaper outlets that he's been awarded a so-called prestigious Human Rights Prize. And he's been described as the man who played a significant contribution in the liberation of Mandela. One of the important points is, despite the various protestations of people like Brian Mulroney that he convinced Margaret Thatcher, when he was in power, and of course the apartheid regime came to an end, during his time in power, the Canadian government's trade, Canada's trade with South Africa went up every year, right? So that's the extent of the hypocrisy. And we all know that one of the key contributors to the defeat of the apartheid regime was Cuba, where over 2,000 Cubans died, right? Sacrificing their lives in the struggle to liberate Southern Africa from the terror of this racist, fascist apartheid regime that carried on a war of terrorism from 1975 to 1988, which is the topic of my recently published book that came out earlier this year. But here you see the hypocrisy, right? One, denying these medical assistance to indigenous people, while Cuban doctors were more than willing and had proven their mettle, and also claiming the credit for the end of apartheid. Some people may not know as well that at one point in Northern Ontario, there were Cuban literacy workers who were there combating the evils of illiteracy, right, among First Nations communities. All of this is forgotten. But we're also living in the context, and I think Owen did an exceptional job in pointing out the hypocrisy of Canadian foreign policy to Canada, right? It was extremely well documented that Canada has acted as, in a sense, a fifth column, a spy based on Cuba. And the documents have come out, very well established that Canada was playing that particular role and so on. But what's important is, at this moment in time, given the geopolitical context that we're living in, the titanic shifts, if I may say so, right? The tectonic shifts that are taking place in geopolitical relations. We're seeing a concerted attack in Canada from all sides to rupture Canada's relations with Cuba, both in terms of the attacks on tourism. We see that with Evan Dyer's numerous articles published in the CBC. We see the numerous articles published in the Hill Times, considering not attacking Cuba not only with the normal falsifications and lies that Cuba is a massive human rights violator, while more massive human rights violations take place across the world. And Cuba, in fact, has been one of the greatest promoters of human rights on the international stage, but also now arguing that Cuba, in many ways, is an extension of Russia or China, and therefore needs to be punished for this. And that was the theme of several articles recently in the Hills Times and so on. So there's this concerted attack to actually break relations of Cuba and Canada, right? An attack, for example, that any tourist who goes, this is what Evan Dye has stated, any Cuban who goes, and he says as well, who goes to Cuba is supporting a military dictatorship, right? There has also been harassment of people who are known Cuban solidarity activists. There's a recent story that came out in Montreal of an activist coming back and being harassed by the immigration officer. Why did you go to Cuba? Who do you know in Cuba? And so forth and so on. on. Questions in the fact that we normally would not associate with Canada, but perhaps we associate with the United States, immigration officials harassing people who've been to Cuba. Of course, one of the things that I really want to stand and I'll talk a bit about later is that the two of the participants on this panel have participated in the Che Guevara Work Brigade and been inspired by that. I'm very much moved by that because from 2008 to 2022, I was a co-chair and national spokesperson of the Canadian Network on Cuba. I now serve in an advisory capacity. And the Che Guevara Work Brigade was an essential, one of the most important projects that we ran to introduce ordinary Canadians to Cuban reality, right? Not to pretend that Cuba is perfect, because no Cuban would say that Cuba is perfect, but to understand what a society is doing to overcome this unceasing US economic hostility, this economic war that's waged against the island, and what Cuba has been able to achieve, not only in the face of this economic war, but a vicious destabilization campaign involving deliberately trying to foment uprisings through discontent in Cuba, right? Organizing oppositionist groups, right, that have no popular support, right? Organizing terrorist attacks against Cubans, okay? That they have been able to withstand this, and despite that, continue to be praised by various United Nations bodies that monitor things such as the well-being of people, right? What Cuba has been able to do in the midst of this horrendous attack is truly amazing, and I think will bring lessons for Canadians on what it's possible to do with limited resources, right? At one point, at the height of the economic crisis of the 1990s, you know, Cuban officials used to say, they don't share the many among the few, but the few among the many. And that was one of the principles that allowed them to overcome this economic crisis and survive. It's important in terms of Canada to understand that historically, Canada-Cuba relations go back to at least the 18th century, where there was a trade of cod, rum, and molasses, right? Okay, from the Cuba and also from the Caribbean to Canada, primarily Atlantic Canada. Okay, and in fact, this kind of trade that exists also tied Canada into the transatlantic slave system, right? Okay, now right now, and I don't have time to go into it, Canada is playing a very significant role to challenge the reparations movement, right? To compensate those who have suffered through the horrors, indigenous genocide, and then the enslavement of African humanity, particularly in the Caribbean through the lawsuit of the CARICOM nations. And Cuba has supported this lawsuit, right? So Canada has deep links there. In 1945, we have the establishment of the first Canadian diplomatic office, actually in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, right? And of course, Owen has spoken about how Canada, along with Mexico, did not break relations, right? But for very different reasons. So with Cuba, when the United States decided to do that through, shall we say, the OAS, this international criminal organization that it was at one particular point in time, and probably still is. Okay, and so Canada maintained that kind of relationship. And people have often spoken about Trudeau, right? And they've often spoken about his relationship with Fidel Castro and so forth and so on. But what's often not discussed is that beyond these kind of official relations, there has been a Canada-Cuba solidarity movement, people-to-people links, people-to-people connections. They go back to the very beginnings of the revolution in the 1960s, when Fair Play for Cuba societies or associations were organized across Canada and extremely active in places like Toronto. Okay, these have all now been followed by various friendship associations. We know that Aminah is a member and now of the executive of the Canada Cuba Friendship Association in Toronto. There's various associations of that nature across Canada. And in 2002, we had the formation of the Canadian Network on Cuba, an attempt to create an umbrella organization that would coordinate and bring these groups closer together in their solidarity with Cuba. Challenging disinformation, educating people about Cuba and so on, but also ensuring that Canada-Cuba relations would be based, or trying to ensure, based on concepts of equality and mutual respect, right? But what we've seen throughout this period is that while Canada has voted against the economic blockade since 1992, right, and maintained these relations, they've played a particular role as what this term that was created, if anybody who studied political science, it comes off actually from a former professor at Dalhousie University, Middlemas, called Canada as a middle power, right? Okay, that Canada would play a particular role where the United States could not play a particular role, right? And so Canada played, in a sense, a very devious role in a variety of these things. Opposing the economic blockade, but at the same time, in many cases, trying to undermine the Cuban political and constitutional system, which was ratified by a mass popular revolution. We see, for example, that when the context of this, right, okay, while Canada has mouthed the idea of supporting non-interference and the support of Cuba's right to self-determination, right, it, in many cases, has made connections and actually worked very closely. We see it even closely today, working with these counter-revolutionary groups within Cuba, who not only have links to the United States, are directly funded by them, but one only has to go to United States documents to see it, right? And in fact, you go to the National Endowment for Democracy, you go to the US State Department, they openly acknowledge how much money they're funding to these particular groups, and that the goal of these groups is to undermine the constitutional order of Cuba. But even when we come back to the annual votes against the US economic war against Cuba, this resolution passed in the United Nations, even though Canada votes against the blockade, it's important to understand, I always encourage, and I teach a course, History of Cuba and other things related to Cuban Revolution, when the vote is coming up, I encourage my students to look on the lives, to link up to the live stream from the United Nations, okay? Because you see various nations coming forward, right, to speak about why they oppose the blockade. The African and Caribbean nations speak so wholesomely of Cuba's internationalism, how Cuba represents an example, right, of the kind of international solidarity, international relations that should exist. Canada and other countries speak very differently, right? Okay, they speak often about the extraterritorial nature impinging on their sovereignty, but they also parrot the same line of the United States of Cuba being a human rights violator and a violator of democracy. I mean, obviously, you know, given the kind of things we see unfolding in Canada and the United States are incredibly hypocritical. But what's interesting as well is, despite voting against the economic blockade, despite having a law in Canada called the Federal Extraterritorial Measures Act, FEMA for short, the blockade against Cuba, this economic war against Cuba, is actually carried out in Canada, and the Canadian government doesn't do anything. We've had the Cuban embassy, for example, right, rent cars from Honda Canada, right, because they have to do their work, and Honda being fined for that by the United States for having violated those sanctions. We had Sabzali, who was an executive, right, who was actually arrested, right, because he was part and parcel of organizing, I think it was the sale of water purifiers to Cuba and so forth, right? We have, for example, that executives of Sheriff, and it's important to understand that not only is Canada the largest source of tourists to Cuba, which is why Aaron Dyer and these guys are targeting tourists, right? But Canada is also the single largest foreign investor in Cuba. And Shared International is the single largest entity of foreign investment in Cuba. I saw there was a question that we could perhaps look at later on in the chat, where somebody asked if you could speak about the mining in Moa, right? And perhaps how Cuba is able to balance its commitment to the environment with the need to exist in an international capitalist sea, right? How do they balance these things? And we can talk about that. But Shared International, and I actually was talking with the executives of Shared International on my last visit to Cuba. I ran into them. I was at a conference for the University of Ireland, and I actually remember talking with them about the investment and the issues they had to go through and so forth. They themselves find that they themselves are targeted, right? And the Canadian government does very little in a sense to ameliorate the impact of the particular blockade. Also, when it comes to Canada's pious, right, renderings about the need for international solidarity, the need to assist those in aid, Canada obviously does not do that. In fact, works to the opposite. But when Cuba has offered to participate with them, okay, the Canadian government has refused. I bring up one example. People are probably familiar with when the earthquake hit Haiti in 2010, but even before that, right, we know that Cuban doctors were the first treating the Haitians, and Cuba has a long historical relationship with Haiti, a tremendous acknowledgement and respect for Haiti, because they see their situation today in the 20th and 21st century as reflecting what happened to the heroic and glorious Haitians because of the Haitian Revolution of ending slavery. And even before that, in the 90s, right, right? And so Fidel Castro met with Jean Chrétien. Chrétien had visited Cuba to inaugurate the airport, the new Jose Marti Airport, and then they sat down, right? And Fidel proposed to him a plan to assist Haiti, right? To, in a sense, challenge this history of marginalization, disenfranchisement, and oppression, of trying to at least to develop Haiti's healthcare system, where Fidel said, listen, you have the money and the resources, we have the expertise and the human capacity to do this, right? And Chrétien dismissed it. All he wanted was Cubans to provide cannon fodder to clear mines, right? Okay, and Fidel rejected that, right? He said, why? Why are we supposed to die, right? Okay, in these projects, right? Simply for the aggrandizement of Canada and so forth. I mean, I could go on to talk about these things, but we live in a very dangerous time right now. And I think in terms of the Canada-Cuba solidarity movement, it's important to understand that the animus of the United States to Cuba today carried on from Trump into Trump passed 243 additional measures made against Cuba that tightened the economic war in a way that people didn't believe it could be tightened. And Biden not only continued his policies, he deepened them even further. Adding on top of that, okay, all sorts of claims, even though debunked by many people in the Pentagon, that Cuba is going to be a base for China, that Cuba is now an economic pawn of Russia and so forth. And we see that echoed here in Canada. And we see how Canada, with the Trudeau regime, goes lockstep with the US imperialist war machine, okay? And Cuba is now seen to be part of these new realignments of geopolitics, right? Particularly with the BRICS and so on, right? Particularly with the call for a new international economic order. Now, Cuba may seem small and relatively powerless on the world stage. Yes, its example, but its example looms large. Its example is very powerful. And these ideas of a new international economic order that is more just, that is more humane, that creates the space for the development of human dignity, actually are ideas that were were stated by Cuba in the early 60s, with the first and second declarations of Havana. And then Cuba played a very important role in pushing the non-aligned movement further. And then when the new international economic order was articulated in 1973, Cuba played a central role, okay, in elaborating and deepening the profundity of these calls. And of course, last year marked the 40th anniversary of the publication of the World Economic Crisis by Fidel Castro, which was a report to non-aligned movement. 2024 will mark, this year, 2020 marked the 40th anniversary. 2024 will mark the 40th anniversary of its international publication. These are very profound contributions, right, to trying to create a world in a sense that was fit for humanity. The last point I'd like to add on this as well is, I'm sitting here and in St. John, New Brunswick, about to participate in probably one of the most important personal events in my life this Saturday, and we're worried about thunderstorms, right? And my part of Canada has suffered through fires earlier on in the spring and summer, and torrential downpours leading to flash flooding, right? All a consequence of climate change. Cuba is a country that has created a climate change plan to 2100, right? That's deeply concerned about climate change, not only for Cuba and Cubans, but for the rest of the world. There's so much that Canada could learn from Cuba, as was pointed out by Aminah and pointed out by Owen, right? But this policy of supporting these continual attacks on the legitimacy of the Cuban system, and now this attack and this deliberate attempt to sabotage tourism and other economic relations with Cuba point to a very dangerous situation that we're living in, right? Defending Canada-Cuba relations is not simply defending Cuba. It's contributing to us transforming Canada into a factor for peace on the world scale. Cuba has been central for calling for the Americas to be a zone of peace, free of nuclear weapons, free of imperialist intrigues, free of being a staging ground for launching wars against peoples, not only in the region, but across the world, right? And in a sense, in our effort to make Canada a factor for peace, in the world, a zone of peace, defending Canada's relations with Cuba and ensuring that they move to a higher level where it is truly based on mutual respect for sovereignty, for self-determination, right? And for the right of the Cuban people to choose their destiny, I think is a central element in that. Thank you.
Wow, Thank you so much, Isaac. Thank you for those passionate words. We're privileged to be able to learn so much from you in such a short period of time. Really moved by your words around the importance of building Canada-Cuba relations in the goal of peace and being zones of peace. And I think it's, amidst all of these attacks that we see on Cuba, I think it is so important to remember how much solidarity Cuba has shown with the rest of the world, especially those who need it the most. So I don't know if I mentioned in the intro, but Isaac was also the co-chair of the Canadian Network on Cuba. And you can find out more about that group at CanadianNetworkOnCuba.ca. And they provided us with a very powerful example of what Cuba solidarity can look like. Also, you can find the link to Isaac's acclaimed book, Cuba, A Revolution in Motion, at Fernwood Publishing, fernwoodpublishing.ca/book/Cuba. So please do check out all of those links and resources. So thank you so much to Isaac, to Aminah, to Owen. This has been an insightful and inspired conversation. We are now moving on to the Q&A. I see that people have posted their questions in the chat.
And Bianca, if I may be allowed one little comment here.
Yes, of course.
Aminah had mentioned when she was there about freedom of religion. Okay, I would recommend, I know it may be an anathema for many people to go to Netflix to watch things, but there is a documentary on Netflix called Bigger Than Africa. And it looks at the impact of the Yoruba religion, of Yoruba culture in the Americas. It looks at Brazil and so forth, Trinidad and Tobago, but it also looks at Cuba and how the Cuban Revolution helped amplify that space for the Yoruba religion.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that additional resource. I'll try and put a link to that in our send out as well. Thanks to all of you who have posted your questions. We also got a few in advance. We only have about another half an hour, but we'll see what we can get to. So we have a question here that is directed at Isaac. B. Sandhu asks, Isaac, are you hopeful that in his second term, if he wins it, Biden may bring Cuba-US relations back to Obama's time? And do you envision Canada playing a role in that? So I invite Isaac to start, but Owen and Aminah, if you have any thoughts on that, please do jump in as well.
Well, I mean, I think my reading, when Biden was running for election, he said he would return to Obama's policies, right? Okay, and there's a debate. Was he sincere about that or not? I have a theory, it may be wrong or not, that I think at one point he was sincere because, the whole idea of reversing Trump's policy was and so forth. And then when he was elected, and don't forget it's in the midst of the pandemic, and when he was elected, okay, he received a briefing, is my thinking, from the CIA, much in the same way that John F. Kennedy received a briefing, because the Bay of Pigs, while unleashed under Kennedy's administration, had been planned under Nixon, right? And Nixon never mentioned it during the campaign, right? And Kennedy inherited it, was told by these guys that this would succeed, and of course it was a failure. And so when Biden received this briefing, Cuba is on its last legs, right? Okay, because the COVID pandemic and the economic crisis is so intense, right? Also that basically speaking, it's a new leadership, because by this time Raul Castro had stepped down, and this historic leadership, right, okay, is now in the background, and this new leadership is untested and doesn't have the historical legitimacy. And also we have planned this meticulously, because on July the 11th, when those things broke out, and of course the Cuban government acknowledged, here were our shortcomings, right? This is what we could have paid more attention to. It was clear that all of these people were orchestrated, from the Twitter accounts to everything else, right? It was carefully planned. That takes a long time in planning. It takes months, if not, of planning and so forth, and resources being put in place, right? It doesn't happen overnight, doesn't happen in a few weeks, right? And so this was going to be the blow, and he was probably told, you will be the president, right? Who will be the first one to defeat the Cuban Revolution, right? Okay, and it failed. And of course, he had an intelligence failure in Afghanistan. And so I think, in a sense, now he was committed to this, because Biden seems to be the kind of person that, cannot adopt the strategic points of recognizing when a particular policy has failed. And we see that in another part of the world, right? Okay, he is determined to carry this on. But I also think it's possible, that there were divisions in the Obama administration, because he didn't visit Cuba with Obama, and he never visited Cuba afterwards, right? So I don't know. This is just my intuitive feeling. But I think what's more important now is they launched it in July 11th. The US is extremely vindictive and they failed, right? Okay. And so in that sense, how Cuba as the unforgivable revolution, the unforgivable example, must be punished even further, right? Okay. And that's been for over 60 years and so forth. But now we have a geopolitical moment, right? In which the world is changing, and Cuba's solidarity cannot be treated sort of like a unilateral issue, because a lot of people in the Cuba solidarity movement like to think of we can only focus on Cuba. But there's been a geopolitical tectonic change in the world, okay? And Cuba is part of that, right? Cuba's resilience is part of that and so forth. And so I think, you know, whether Biden wins or not, the geopolitical situation will continue. The decline of US imperialism, right? The fact that a multipolar world is emerging, right? Whether it will last, some people can argue. The fact that the BRICS, right? The fact that Latin America and things are emerging in Latin America. What's happened in West Africa, for example, okay? And so forth. How long that will last? I mean, are these do these things have, you know, significant ability, right, to survive any imperialist pressure? A whole number of things on a world scale demonstrate that US power is, if not on decline, is increasingly challenged in ways and in all spheres it had never been challenged before. And Latin America is its backyard. And Blinken at one point said the front line of the struggle, and he said this against China, okay, because that's the one they're extremely worried about, is in Latin America. And in a sense, that is a restatement of the Monroe Doctrine of Manifest Destiny. We must have hegemony in Latin America if we are going to remain the dominant power on the world stage, right? Okay. And Cuba, in a sense, right, has challenged the imperial hegemony for too long. And so I think, you know, there are specifics that are related to the peculiarities of particular regimes that come to power in the United States, governmental regimes, but also there is a long-term inertia and logic of US imperialist policy, right? And I'd like to end on this one point. You know, we just marked the birthday of Fidel Castro a few days ago. We're coming up to the 7th anniversary of his death in November, right? But it was a certain perspicacity and foresight that Fidel had, right? Edward Galeano and others would say that Fidel would travel to the future and come back and tell people how things were, right? And I remember when Obama visited, he wrote a reflection, okay, an essay that was much dismissed, but he told people, despite this so-called thaw, okay, they should always be aware of US imperialist logic and intentions, right? And I think he has been proven correct.
Thank you, Isaac. Owen, Aminah, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I was gonna echo what Isaac is saying. I think that because of like relationships globally that are shifting, and what we're watching that's happening in West Africa, what we're seeing happening in Europe, right? Like how this war in Europe has impacted, I'm from Pakistan, it's impacted Pakistan, it's impacted Africa, it's impacted the whole world. And we're also seeing like, yeah, the decline of US power, BRICS, as Isaac mentioned, you know, and I do think things are shifting, and I think that is going to impact foreign policy from the US. However, I would not really, what I've learned about democracy and socialism is that Canada is lacking democracy and definitely socialism. But I think that I don't have any hope or faith for US politicians or Canadian politicians because I think that their policies continue to be warmongering and harmful to third world countries, the global south, and punitive. And so I just don't have faith in that. But what I have faith in is movements. And what I've learned about Cuba and what I've learned about places in Latin America that I've never been to is that social movements and worker movements and trade unionists, you know, and worker power is where we're going to see change. And in America too, we're going to see change through worker power. You know, with the brigade, we did see many Amazon labor union comrades who are from the executive, they came out. And I do think that that's a testament to changes, right? Like people can say what they want to say, but like we're in 2023 and we have the president of a union, the Amazon Labor Union, Chris Smalls, come all the way to Cuba, and go meet with the Cuban trade unions, and his executive was there. And I think that and there were conversations back and forth, because the executive is also immigrants and Black workers from America who spoke about the struggles in the United States. So I really have more faith in people and ordinary people than any of these elected officials.
Yeah, and I would just say that if there was ever a moment when the Biden administration was going to re-engage with Cuba, I think it's past. The July 11th protests for the US leadership, that was them scenting blood. And I think that from their view, Cuba seems weak, and they'll only keep upping the pressure to try to overthrow the government. And Biden, he could have reversed so many Trump-era policies, like with Yemen, with Venezuela, and he didn't. And now in the US press, there's so much fear-mongering about Cuba too. Cuba as an outpost of Russian or Chinese influence in America's backyard. It's been totally subsumed into this new Cold War. And as for the second part of the question, Canada playing a role, I don't see that happening. Trudeau is so openly anti-Cuba at this point. There's no incentive for him to back re-engagement there, or to back publicly a lifting of the blockade. And Canadian media is increasingly anti-Cuba as well. I mean, we've pointed out the articles by Evan Dyer, which are just atrocious. He would get attacked in the media if he were to launch an initiative of that kind. And I think that if there's any hope for kind of a reintegration of the Cuban economy with surrounding countries, with other countries in the world, it's going to come from outside the US and Canada. It's going to come maybe from an organization like BRICS, maybe BRI would play a role, regional integration initiatives with Venezuela, Mexico, or other countries. It will not come from Canada or the US, in my opinion.
Thank you. So yeah, this panel is called Canada and Cuba, past and present. We have a question from Avram about the past. He says, should we consider popularizing the role of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, notwithstanding any flaws, in standing up to the US on Cuba and calling for that example to be emulated? Not perfect, but way better than we are now. What are your thoughts on that? Should we be lauding Pierre Elliott Trudeau?
I would say no. I think we could do better than that. I mean, Trudeau, his Cuba policy was very opportunistic. It was very selfish. It was a piece of political theater that he used to brand himself, and that has subsequently been used to brand Canada in relation to US policy. Aminah talked about being inspired by trade unionists, activists, and there are a lot of people in Canada like that who are engaging with Cuba, who are, doing a lot to make sure that these face-to-face interactions happen, that brigades happen, that education initiatives happen. I think that these are the people who are really standing up to US policy on Cuba. It was never somebody like Trudeau, and I don't think it would be any Canadian prime minister in the future either.
Yeah. And I agree with Owen. I mean, I think, why should we go to the lowest common denominator? I think that, the issues on a world scale are so challenging and so dire when it comes to Canada-Cuba relations. It's simply that Canada should respect Cuba as an equal and respect its right to self-determination and sovereignty. And let's not bear in mind that when the racist South African regime, right, invaded with the support of the United States, Angola in 1975, and Cuba responded, okay, when Africa called, right, as it has always done, responded and repelled the racist invasion, right? And people condemned Cuba, right? Canada condemned Cuba, and Canada cut off its aid to Cuba, right? Trudeau did that, right? Even though when it was patently obvious, right, that Cuba had acted at the behest of an independent country that had faced external aggression, right, and it saved them from a racist nightmare, right? Okay, Trudeau cut off aid, right, demonstrating that his idea of a third way, which was between the two superpowers, was nothing but shall we say, hot air.
Thank you to all. Aminah, you had talked a little bit about worker power, and Megan has a question here. Megan says, as a young worker in the trade union movement within the public sector in the province of Ontario, I have noticed that many of our unions don't seem to have any relationships with trade unions in Cuba. Am I missing something, or has there historically been no relationships with Canadian public sector trade unions and international countries with strong public sectors like Cuba? And if so, why is this? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, hello, Megan. I might know that, Megan, but I think that, okay, so from trying to research, I was trying to read report backs, and look at what, because I knew people were going. And by the way, I also don't want to limit it just to trade unions. There's so much history of organizing and activism in the anti-war movement and in the peace movement. And I learned, that there's faith groups, Christian faith groups all over Canada that have been really active in, the Cuba Solidarity organizing as well. But I over the years, I feel like a lot of unions were going to Cuba. I know that Cuba was also active in, it's called the Tri-National Defense of Public Education, which is like Canada, America, Mexico, and I think Cuba was involved in that. Like, there's just so much history. It's hard to find reports, though. So this is my frustration, is like the consolidating of reports. But actually, there is a lot of history of CUPE, NUPG, CUPW, the postal workers, UFCW, private sector unions. And also, I just think that because Cuba and Canada have had this tourist, dynamic, which is obviously not out of choice, it has benefited a lot of workers. And why I say that is because Cuba has been an inexpensive trip for more of the working class, I would say, and the working poor. Why I'm saying that is because my experience as an organizer is that growing up in Canada, nail technicians, retail workers, everybody could save up money, and take a vacation to Cuba rather than go to, more expensive destinations in the Caribbean and, that people can't really afford. And so it has been a privilege for millions of Canadians. And when you travel there, you do meet a lot of trade unionists. But I do think that there is a lot of history of partnerships and delegations. It takes a lot of research. Like I said, CUPE and NUPG have had a 20-year partnership, and a lot of CUPE National has worker training centers that they've been donating to, training people in health and safety, and that's just one union. Now, are all the unions great on this? No. But there's a lot of positive, I think, history. I just wish it was like consolidated somewhere, so someone should write a book on that. But it's not really consolidated. It's hard to find.
Yeah, Aminah.
If I may add one thing. One of the problems that this union movement has faced, and I've worked with, and I know that there's several people who are in the chat who worked with various unions and have a long history, much longer than mine, with the Canada Cuba Solidarity movement, was that quite often there were policies that were passed, right, and resolutions were passed, but it's the implementation that matters. And quite often there were like Denny Lemelin, who was the president of CUPE at one point, right? You had John Newman at USVW, but quickly Jose Ogas. You have people who believe in this cause, who understand that the struggle is international, right? And then they retire, or for other reasons are no longer there, and somebody comes on, and there's been sort of a neoliberalization of many people in the unions, not all unions, I don't want to, of their conception of what is possible, right? Okay, and therefore they've fallen into this kind of very narrow conception, right? Focusing in national areas. So there's been ups and downs in this particular movement. I'd like also to draw, and this is getting back to the point when you asked Aminah about the role of workers in Cuba, and I've posted the link to a very good book by Pedro Ross Leal, who used to be the head of the Confederation of Cuban Workers, or the CTC, the central worker, very important figure. He was a very important figure in Cuba, is now retired, served as ambassador, and he wrote a book about what was called the workers' parliaments. And at the height of the economic crisis, and I understand, at the economic crisis in Cuba during the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? there was a time in August of '94 when Cuba's National Assembly got together and they talked about various economic measures by which to deal with the crisis. And there was some that had never happened during the history of the Cuban Revolution before. And there was a big debate in the Cuban National Assembly. And the decision was made, we must hear from the people, right? And particularly the workers. And so what was happened was there were a series of what were called workers' parliaments were convened, over 80,000 meetings where the direction of the Cuban Revolution, where strategic decisions were discussed and reaffirmed and so forth. And he's written this book that is probably the best book in terms of the details of how this parliamentarization of Cuba, this workers' input, helped to consolidate, save the Cuban Revolution and reaffirm its directions, and find solutions out of the economic crisis it faced.
Thank you, Isaac. We're going to continue exploring questions around Canada's policies. We've got a question here from Marthad, who wants to know, what role is Chrystia Freeland playing, if any, in opposing the reparations movement and opposing Cuba's pro-reparations stance? What is Canada in general doing to oppose those reparations? So yeah, I mean, also if any of you could comment a little bit on the reparations movement as well, for anyone that may not know about that.
Yeah, so I guess I can talk about that. I'm a member also of the steering committee of the Global African Congress. And I don't want to spend, I know my answers can be long, but some people may remember that in August and September of 2001, there was a major United Nations conference called United Nations International Conference Against Racism, Xenophobia, and Other Related Tolerance. And that was a major international event, right? And this conference, usually called WCAR for short, okay? The United States, Canada, Great Britain, and other Western countries were isolated on the topic of reparations. And in fact, these, United States, Canada, and Britain walked out of the conference itself. It was headline news, right? Okay, it was a major defeat for the West, and of course we've forgotten about it because 9/11 happened right after that and transformed at that moment geopolitics and so forth. Reparations was this huge issue, right? But coming out of that was a group called the Global African Congress, which became sort of a very important civil society group, right? Okay, I've just joined it a few years ago, right? Became part of the International Steering Committee. And so now, as Sir Hilary Beckles, who is the leading scholar in reparations, talks about, the reparations movement has a deep history in the global Black liberation struggle. We're now in our fifth movement of it, right? And it's primarily the CARICOM, the 15 nations that make up the CARICOM, which is sort of like the independent English speaking Caribbean, have put a suit against these various European powers for reparations, and not just money, but a whole development program. It involves very significant changes, even calling what we could say social changes between relations between nations, changes of social relations. They've launched this for a call for reparations for indigenous genocide and for transatlantic slave trade, right? Canada has actively attempted to sabotage this, to undermine it. Why? By first saying it does not apply to Canada, because at first they would say Canada had no history of slavery. And of course, you can't deny that history. I encourage people to read The Hanging of Angelique and the burning of Old Montreal and the untold story of slavery in Canada by Dr. Fua Cooper, the work by Imani Whitfield. There's also a report from the Lord on Dalhousie University's links to slavery. A whole number of different things have happened, right? Okay. And then they would say, well, Canada wasn't a country at that particular time, right? Because Canada only comes into existence on July 1st, 1867. Slavery ends in the British Empire in the 1830s, and that has nothing to do with us, despite the fact that, we celebrate, Canadian government officially celebrates 1812 as being fundamentally part of its history, but that's before 1867. So that's one of the things. So what's happened as the reparation movement has gained steam is they've attempted to sabotage it by saying reparations is nonsensical or has no meaning for the world today. And they've also tried to mobilize people within the African Canadian community, Black community, right? People who have, I would argue, very reactionary views on these issues and so forth, right? So just as they, Canada actively worked against the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the United Nations, and I should add, as in a parenthesis, some people don't know this, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has a Cuban fingerprint, if not handprint on it. The late Alfonso Martinez, who was a major Cuban diplomat, played a central role in the crafting of that document, visiting indigenous communities across the world, including Canada, right, to help craft that very important international legal instrument for indigenous rights, right, and so on, and redress of the historical disenfranchisement, marginalization, and dispossession. So Canada has actively opposed the reparations movement, both within Canada and also internationally and so forth. And a very important person perhaps to talk up to that about is Sikaya Thomas, who is sort of like the head of the, I work with him in the International Steering Committee. He's been central to all of this. And those of you who are interested in this, I'm going to put in the chat, we have a big conference coming up in Halifax that will be talking about reparations. It's on slavery, October 18th to the 19th and so forth. So when it comes to Chrystia Freeland obviously buys in to these neoliberal nostrums, right? She buys into tying Canada further into the imperialist warmongering. She ties Canada further into ensuring that the West must remain the hegemonic power, right? And obviously there can be no redress for the past, because reparations in its fundamental sense, as Beckles, others, and I myself have argued, is not about money. It's about transforming both internally in countries, but externally relations in the world. And in a sense, it rebounds to the benefit of everybody's liberation. And therefore, for people like Chrystia Freeland, who represent the neoliberal world, who represent this parasitic ruling caste, it means them losing their status of power and privilege.
Thank you, Isaac. So we have a question from Alan. It's been touched upon a bit, but I think worth elaborating on. Alan says, I'm hopeful that in our changing world, the expansion of BRICS and the changes across Latin America could bode well, have a positive impact on Cuba. Do any of our panelists have any comments on this, BRICS and the changes across Latin America? And whether this is a hopeful moment?
Yeah, if I could just kind of expand the question a bit to look at how multipolarity itself affects Cuba and relates to Cuba. So when I was in Cuba, I saw a lot of factories and a lot of plants of various kinds with Chinese flags flying over them. And I was curious, so I asked our guide about that, and he explained that Chinese investment is very important to Cuba, and it's increasingly important to Cuba at the moment. You also have, Venezuela, which has helped Cuba a lot in the past, slowly recovering economically. It wants to join BRICS, which is positive. Mexico under AMLO calling for a global anti-blockade movement. But at the same time, life is hard in Cuba, and deprivation caused by the blockade is real. Another Cuban I spoke to when I was there told me that the special period never ended, and that the government is still desperately looking for ways to increase revenue. And we could also bring in what a lot of people have called the new pink tide, or the second wave of the pink tide, which is a positive development, but also we could say it's less stable and less committed than the previous one. I mean, you have governments like Gabriel Boric in Chile, which has become increasingly embarrassing, you might say. Lula is quite constrained in Brazil, and the recent election results in Argentina definitely don't bode well. But there are things to be optimistic about with BRICS, for example, with the Belt and Road. But there's also a lot of reason to maintain reasonable expectations and to recognize the difficult position that Cuba finds itself in, while of course maintaining that solidarity with the revolution.
Just a quick follow-up for you, Owen. You had talked about several countries, including Venezuela, and I'm wondering if you have any insight into how or whether Canada's recent interventions in Venezuela impacted its relationship with Cuba.
Yeah, I remember a news story coming out. It was either 2019 or 2020. It was quite a ridiculous story about how Chrystia Freeland and the Canadian Foreign Affairs Department was going around to leftist governments in Latin America, trying to get them to betray Venezuela. And they were even holding talks with Cuba about that, which was just baffling to me that the Canadian government could be so deluded as to think that they could turn Cuba against Venezuela. Under Hugo Chavez, Venezuela was the staunchest ally of Cuba in the hemisphere for sure. I mean, the way that it transported energy to Cuba to help with the impacts of the blockade. It was incredible the impact that had. But the way that Canada has tried to rally the reactionary forces in the hemisphere against Venezuela, the way that it's supported the sanctions regime, imposed sanctions of its own, I mean, that has had a huge impact on Venezuela's ability to help Cuba. You also had Canadian officials on the ground in Venezuela organizing the opposition and bragging about it. I mean, the interference by Canada in Venezuela was so wide-ranging. I mean, financial, it was political, it was on the ground. And yeah, it's had a huge impact on Cuba. It's just another reason to think that going forward, the Canadian government is not going to do anything materially to relieve the suffering in Cuba caused by the blockade. I mean, its policies against Venezuela especially have exacerbated that suffering. So that's what I would say to that. The relationship between Venezuela and Cuba has suffered economically because of Canada's actions.
Yeah, and if I may add something to that, I think when when Chrystia Freeland had cobbled together this Lima group, right, which was to be in opposition to CELAC, right, and which was this grouping that excluded Canada and the United States, right, and was had been sort of the brainchild of Venezuela and Cuba to bring all these people together. When she cobbled together Lima and it collapsed, there's that same kind of vindictiveness, right? Okay, not recognizing how this whole process had failed, where now just as you have this vindictiveness that always existed, but now has been deepened by the failure of July 11 in Cuba. You have this idea that, that we failed in Lima, but somehow the determination, right, to continue to undermine or Venezuela and of course Cuba continues quite significantly. What's important, as one was pointing out, that not only was Cuba called, right? Okay, not only was there a conversation, Miguel Diaz-Canel, the president of Cuba, to draw him into this, shall we say, cabal against Venezuela, that what happened was they published, I mean, she bullied him in it, right? She was so disrespectful, right? So she published, right, her exchange with him, right? Okay, and it was like, I am talking to a peon. There was no respect for him as a leader of a sovereign nation, because these are third world countries. Like I come from Trinidad and Tobago, half my roots lie in the Caribbean. So we don't count, right? We are not significant, right, in terms of meaningful people on the world stage. It was so demeaning that the Cubans published their own transcript of the discussion, right? Okay, and it was clear that Miguel Diaz-Canel, in very cogent, coherent, but forceful ways, not only rebuffed her attempts, but refuted the very basis of her arguments and so forth. There was also, it's interesting, there was an article, this is getting back to the issue of China, right, and what's happening in Latin America. There was an article that was circulated in the US media, and quite often what they do is they circulate these articles that may seem incredibly fantastical, far-fetched, and dreadful as trial balloons, which actually said, should the United States now consider particular strikes against Cuba because of Cuba's increasing relationship with China, right? I think that sort of illustrates the thinking in certain ruling circles, right, in the United States, and I think within Canada, because Canada is so tight in and so increasingly integrated into the US war-making machinery, right, that the geopolitical stakes are so high that we're living in a different world in which the dangers are really not just phantoms, they're real dangers of conflagration, escalation, and crimes against the peoples that we have never seen, at least in our lifetimes.
Thank you, Isaac. So we're nearly at the end of our time together, and there's still, a number of really great questions, but I think I'm going to just move to the questions that are about solidarity as a way to kind of end our discussion. And maybe also a reflection on the resolve of people in Cuba. So just very quickly, Robert wants to know, says the Cuban consul from Toronto spoke to the CUPE Ontario Convention and spoke about the increasing hardships the Cuban people face as a result of the blockade, but denied the newspaper's claim that the Cuban people have quote unquote had enough. What do speakers think? Is the resolve of people in Cuba weakening or increasing? And maybe it could be good to hear from Owen and Aminah about your experiences and what you thought based on your recent trips to Cuba.
Yeah, I think that people always are asking about what it's like to be there. Yeah, I think the hardships are a reality. And the hardships are very apparent. The lack of food, material, resources, when you travel there, and if you come with the brigade, you need to be packing everything that you're going to be using, because really there isn't hard currency there. There isn't material resources to be wasted. But Cuban people are resilient, and they continue to build infrastructure. They continue to be creative and innovative. We learn that through all of the various sectors, biotech, art. However, I think it's obvious, and I think everyday Cubans will tell you when you see them that the hardship is because of the blockade, and that their lives aren't very simple because of the blockade. And I think that we learned that by going there. And I think when tourists go there, they learn that too. And I think that I don't think anybody's denying that, but what we need to focus on is what are the root of those problems. And similarly, when we look at the issues in Canada that are different, what are the root of the problems in Canada? Housing crisis, the inequity, inflation, the war. So it's about looking at the structural and systemic issues. And the biggest issue for Cuba is the embargo. And if the embargo didn't exist, I'm sure that the Cuban success story and model, I really believe, would be in other places.
Yeah, I just add that during my time in Cuba, like I saw a lot of public support for the Cuban government. I saw it at May Day. I mean, the crowd that came out for May Day was maybe the biggest crowd I've seen anywhere in my life. It was truly astounding. And I also went to a block party in the city of Santa Clara, and I was speaking to this old lady in my very poor Spanish, and she told me that Cubans like to do two things more than anything else. They like to dance and they like to fight, to resist. And you definitely see that attitude walking around Cuba. Like, we were going through Havana in our Che Guevara shirts, and somebody stopped us and he said, we should all be like Comrade Che. And you could just see the dedication in his face and hear it in his tone. At the same time, there is an immigration crisis on the island. It's quite bad. A lot of people want to leave for economic reasons. Those are the grim realities imposed by the blockade. So overall, like, is the result weakening? Is it strengthening? I don't know. I can't know. I just know what I saw, which was an immense amount of energy and commitment from the Cuban people.
Yeah. And if I may add one thing, I think it's important that we need to place things in context. Cuba is facing a significant immigration crisis, but so is the rest of Latin America, right? Okay, as someone coming from Trinidad and Tobago, there are more Trinidadians now live outside of Trinidad and Tobago than there. The Jamaicans are leaving Jamaica. I talk to people. So it's part of a regional and global crisis, right? And of course, one of the things is that, of course, when the Cubans, there was a very, very good article that appeared in Granma one time, during the height of the special period in the 1990s of the crisis. And he said, somebody came in and said, oh my God, these Cubans are so happy with so little, right? And he said, no, we're not happy, right? Okay, with this stuff, but we understand where the main cause of the problem comes. Yes, Cubans have made internal errors, right? Any human project, okay, makes errors, right? But what Cuba is driven by is a commitment to defend its sovereignty and to defend, right, the basic human dignity of its citizens, right? When July the 11th happened, right, okay, in San Antonio de los Banos, right? Miguel Diaz-Canel, as Fidel had done in a similar disturbance on August the 5th, 1999, went to the people, right? Okay, and began significantly addressing these issues, right? And it's clear the economic war against Cuba has been a central cause of its problems. But also, if you look at the UN Human Development Reports, and if you look at where Cuba stands compared to the vast majority of countries in the global South, right? Cuba is not doing as bad as those countries, right? But because of immense ideological, right, and propaganda apparatus that the West has, right? Many people believe that in the Americas, in places like Canada and Western Europe, the streets are, paved with gold and running with milk and honey and so forth. But the crisis that Cuba faces has specificities to Cuba because of its unique history and role of a space of resistance, but also is part of a regional crisis as well. But what's interesting, and Owen was made an important point. He talked about economic reasons. When people have done surveys of these people who have left, they've left for economic reasons. They would love to stay in Cuba. But I have a friend who is living here, he's from Cuba. He loves Cuba, he wants to live in Cuba, but his field, right, okay, is something that he cannot make a career in Cuba with, right, because of the limitations and so forth. Many Trinidadians, and I talk to many of my friends, right, would love to live in Trinidad and Tobago, but nobody wants to live in Trinidad in its current context, right, many of them because of the economic crisis. So I need to think we need to put these things in context as well, right? But as I said in my early comments, what Cuba has been able to do with healthcare, with education, right, with social security, and with stability and generally a sense of safety across the island is unique, right? And really is something that stands out given the extent of this unceasing economic war, this unceasing siege by the United States.
Well said. Thank you. So the last two questions I'm going to take are from James and John. I'll just read their questions in succession. James wants to know, James says, we're in a dangerous moment as the Cuban economy continues to be undermined by the blockade. We need new strategies to mobilize public opinion here in support of Cuba. The Canadian government may be hypocritical, but how do we mobilize aid and solidarity? And then John wants to know, can you share concrete steps that individuals can take to support Cuban people here in Canada? So I'd love to hear any of your last thoughts on this before we close out for the evening. Isaac.
No, I mean, I've spoken a lot, but I'd like to say one of the key things, obviously, is that the number of tourists to Cuba has increased over 2022. Cuba is not blessed with immense resources, right? Okay, I mean, Fidel Castro himself said that, right? I mean, the move to the tourist industry was a necessary evil, okay? And they knew it brought with it a number of problems, negative consequences, right? Distortions and so forth. But the money made from the tourist industry and the way Cuba has been handled is extremely important. And the Cuban economy holds on to much more of the tourist dollar than, for example, Barbados or Jamaica, right? And so one of the things I think it's important is to challenge what Evan Dyer has attempted to do, right? I mean, it's not just him operating on his own, right? Okay. And I wish somebody would find out what his links to the right are in Latin America, specifically and so on, because he's not an objective, dispassionate, disinterested observer. He is on a mission. And obviously, it's a mission that has been sanctioned when you look at other things happen by certain factions of the Canadian ruling elite, right? So it's one to defend the fact that the Canadian economic links with Cuba are not eroded, are not attacked, right? And are not canceled out, right? As some people would like to see it done, right? And so tourism is very important. And this attack on tourism, I think, is really a deadly thing. But also to continue, I think, to argue that Canada's relations with Cuba, as it should be based with every country in the world, should be based on mutual respect, equality, and the respect for the right of self-determination and sovereignty, right? Okay. And I should argue that supporting the right of self-determination and sovereignty is a revolutionary act in today's conditions. It's when the West has violated self-determination and sovereignty that we have seen the most egregious human rights violations occur.
And then I would just reiterate, the importance of face-to-face interactions. You can travel to Cuba. Tourism money is very important. Talk to regular Cubans, get their opinions, build solidarity, build networks. There's a lot of opportunity to do that through the Canadian network on Cuba, and share those experiences with family, with friends, and others. And then, in terms of just something small but concrete, there's an organization called Not Just Tourists that if you go to Cuba and you bring a checked bag full of aid, medical aid, toothbrushes, toothpaste, whatever, they will pay the cost of that checked bag for you. So if you go to Cuba, that's just something to consider that would have a positive impact for sure.
Thank you, Owen. Aminah.
Yeah, I would just say, always look in your community, see what's going on. There are so many groups doing different things and have a history of doing great work. So connecting with, even if it's a church organization and or a local community group that just has interest in doing anti-war work and they have a chapter. But also, if you are in a union, I always say this, like, stay involved, see what money is allocated for professional development, see what money is allocated for, different resources, and be involved and read what's going on in local conferences, and look if there is an international department or if there are statements being made, because sometimes I promise you there's an elder and an activist that just, cares about Cuba, and they exist, and sometimes they just need another person, but it takes a little bit of research.
Thank you so much.
Solidarity organizations for Cuba.
Solidarity organizations, exactly. And then that's in part how we were able to get our panel together today, was in large part through the work of the solidarity organizations, like the network. So that is all that we have time for today. It's been a riveting discussion. I feel very inspired, very much want to go on a trip to Cuba right now. And I just want to say that I learned so much. I want to thank the panelists for your excellent presentations, and your responses to all of the questions. I want to thank the audience for participating so well in the chat and with all of your questions. And just want to reiterate the calls sort of to action that our panelists have put forward. You know, sharing your experiences, building connections, finding ways in your community or groups to sort of get involved. Also, you know, the importance of supporting first and foremost, as Isaac said, the right to self-determination and sovereignty, and just how important that is, you know, that principle of like, just first do no harm, you know? That is it for our program. I just want to thank you all again, and hopefully I'll see you soon. So good evening, everybody, and as always, peace.
Thank you, Bianca, Owen, and Aminah, and thanks to everybody.